We are in Daniel 4 this morning, so if you would be turning over there we will get to that in just a moment. Once we get past Daniel 4, the order of study is going to be different from the way the book is organized. And I will be explaining why once we get to that point. In other words, when we get finished with Daniel 4, we're not going to Daniel 5. And I will explain why at that point. There is a good reason why we will not go in order. And it has to do with chronological reasons. But we will explain all that once we get to that point. But Daniel 4 is where we are today. Now, the time frame that elapsed between Daniel chapters 3 and 4 is a considerable period of time. How many years? We're not told. Daniel does not mention it. But there is a considerable time frame that has passed in between chapter 3 and chapter 4. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, have been promoted at the end of chapter 3 in the province of Babylon, but then they're never mentioned again in the book of Daniel. Now, why is that? Most likely it's because those three men at some point between Daniel 3 and Daniel 4 passed away. We're not told why or how. We assume they died of natural causes. But in the time frame that elapsed, you have Nebuchadnezzar building up the kingdom of Babylon, building up the city of Babylon to the point where when you read different introductory books or encyclopedias or dictionaries concerning Babylon, you will find a rough sketch of how the city had become advanced as far as building projects and as far as the things that were done in the city itself under Nebuchadnezzar's leadership. And that sets the stage for what's about to take place in Daniel 4. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon was one of the 7 original wonders of the world. And that was developed, of course, in the Babylonian Empire. And Nebuchadnezzar was reigning over all of this. By far, he reigned the longest of any ruler in the Babylonian Empire. And it was really good for the providence of God that he did that, as we're going to see. In all these years that Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar knew each other, almost from the very beginning, in fact, Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar had an affinity toward each other. That is, they felt a kinship of sorts. Nebuchadnezzar was attracted to Daniel's personality and his ingenuity and his wisdom, of course. But then Daniel was attracted to Nebuchadnezzar, likely because he saw in Nebuchadnezzar something that the ruler didn't see in himself. He saw a man who was very religious, even though he was devoted to pagan gods. But he saw something else in Nebuchadnezzar that he liked. Nebuchadnezzar was, of course, the most brutal ruler that the world had seen up to that point. But Nebuchadnezzar was also capable of kindnesses and also capable of doing good things. And so for whatever reason, Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar strike this friendship, and Daniel is working for Nebuchadnezzar, in fact, in the kingdom of Babylon, in the city of Babylon, and is faithfully carrying out his duties without, of course, being unfaithful to his God. But that sets the stage for what we're about to see. And so Daniel 4 begins, Nebuchadnezzar the king unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. Do you see the shift here? Up until the end of Daniel 3, Daniel has been the one narrating the story. But now it shifts in chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar is the one that's talking. Nebuchadnezzar is the one that is speaking here. And likely he is issuing out an edict or some sort of royal statement to all the people in the kingdom. And Daniel thinks it's so significant that he, through inspiration of the Holy Spirit, includes it here in his prophetic book. And I would not hesitate to think that Daniel helped him draft this thing. That Daniel helped him draft the statement that was sent out to the empire for the reasons that you're going to see as we go through the chapter. Verse 2, I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. Now wait a minute. At the end of chapter 3, you've got Nebuchadnezzar saying that you can't say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but yet he hasn't exalted God, Jehovah, above all other gods. But now here at the beginning of chapter 4, you have him saying that the high God, not a God, the high God has wrought toward me. Here we find a man whose faith was allowing no room at all for idol gods. What a change. Nebuchadnezzar's name was after one of the gods that Babylon worshipped and that his family had worshipped. And now here we have him saying, the Most High God hath wrought toward me signs and wonders. Now what caused this change? Verse 3. How great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. This is a man who is dead earnest in what he was saying. There's no hypocrisy here. There's no pretense. There's no wink and a nudge. It is completely honest. Now, how did he come to have such a faith in the one God? He's about to explain. Verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in mine house, and flourishing in my palace. One day, he's just as he always is, and under no pressure, no fear at all. He's at the peak of his ruling, the peak of his power. Verse 5, I saw a dream. Here's another dream. Nebuchadnezzar's already had dreams that have troubled him, and now he's going to have another one. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Therefore, I made a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known unto me the interpretation of the dreams. That sound familiar? It's because we've seen it already take place. Way back in Daniel 2, years before, when he had that dream, that great image, he called in all the wise men and all the enchanters and to try to give him the interpretation. Is he going to expect the same result? He should, because they couldn't do it before and they're not going to be able to do it now. Then came in the magicians, the astrologers or enchanters, the Chaldeans and the soothsayers. And I told the dream before them, but they did not make known unto me the interpretation thereof. Now notice, significantly, the three Hebrew young men, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are not mentioned here. Most likely, as we've already indicated, because they have since passed from the scene. They're no longer there. But Daniel still is. Verse 8. At the last Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And before him I told the dream, saying. Now notice, he knew that Daniel had great powers. At the point at which he's reciting this, not where he is now as he is writing it or as he's dictating it possibly to Daniel, but at that point when he called Daniel in, he recognized that Daniel had power, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. That was Nebuchadnezzar's thought process at the time. He didn't make room, that is, he did not shove out all of the Babylonian gods for the one true God. It was part of his pantheon in his mind. He was no atheist. That's the point. Nebuchadnezzar was no atheist. He believed in higher powers, but he did not believe in the high power. Verse 9. O Belteshazzar, master of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in thee, and no secret troubleth thee, tell me the visions of my dream that I have seen, and the interpretation thereof. Thus were the visions of mine head in my bed. And behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. Now, instead of a great image, it's a great tree. And quite obviously, this great tree represents the exalted position of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful ruler on the face of the earth at this point. Verse 11. The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. Nebuchadnezzar's power and his influence was great, extending all throughout the known world at that point. The leaves thereof were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all. The beast of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all flesh was fed on it. So far, so good. Everything's okay so far in this dream. It's nothing like the great, terrible image which he had seen as a great tree, and everybody's flourishing, everybody's doing all right. Verse 13. I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and a holy one came down from heaven. An angelic being, a divine being of some sort. Nebuchadnezzar recognizes it as a divine being coming down from heaven. He cried aloud. Now here Nebuchadnezzar's memory is keen. He knows exactly what he saw. And said thus, hew down the tree and cut off his branches. Shake off his leaves and scatter his fruit. Let the beast get away from under it, and the fowls from his branches. Now, this was arousing the great anxiety that Nebuchadnezzar was having. This great tree that prospered everyone that came around it, now the order is given from on high to cut it down and scatter it. Nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots, notice that, in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, and the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beast and the grass of the earth. Notice now that it subtly shifts from a tree to a person. Let him, let his. Note further. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. Whoever this represents is going to have the heart of an animal given until 7 times pass. Now we will refrain from saying anything about those 2 points until later on in the chapter. Just note that in your mind, what this divine being has said. Verse 17. This matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, angelic beings, in other words, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. You talk about sobering. That dream would sober Nebuchadnezzar. Fear had seized him. This is overwhelming. Now, what does that say about God? Pausing right here. God's in control. What does that say about the current state of affairs in our world today? God is in control. What does that say about who's put in place in different places of power and authority around the world? God is in control. God's in control over the big picture. Now, it is very much the case that base men and evil men have ruled different countries around the world and been responsible for the murder and the massacre of millions upon multiplied millions of people, innocent people, and people of different races, different nationalities, different economic classes, and there have been tens of millions of people killed under the banner of Nazism, under the banners of communism. Does that say then that God does not exist, that God's not in control? No, it does not. Because one thing is being left out of the equation in all this. Satan. Satan still is the prince of the power of the air. and he is still the prince of this world. Do you think that he controls the minds of individuals today? If you don't think that, then you're not paying attention. Look around you and see all the crime that's going on, all of the violence that's going on, all of the insubordination and violation of laws of the land. Who's responsible for all that? Satan's responsible for it, not God. But is God still in control of things? You better believe He is. Was something done about Adolf Hitler? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. It took a war. It took tens of thousands of young men to give their lives so that Hitler might come down, but he did, and that freedom might once again reign. What about communism? Well, it took many years, but the Soviet Union finally collapsed. And there are still communist dictatorships around the world, but is God still in control? You better believe it. God works on His time. He doesn't work on our time. And just because there have been murderous dictators and thugs that have brutalized nations and different ethnic groups does not mean that God is not in control, and it does not mean that there is no God. He is still where He's always been, and He's still reigning over the affairs of men, and He giveth it to whomsoever He will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. That's God's choices. Verse 18, this dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now thou, O Belteshazzar, declare the interpretation thereof, for as much as all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known unto me the interpretation. But thou art able, for the Spirit of the holy gods is in thee. I can just see in my mind Nebuchadnezzar sitting there with a smile on his face, even though he's full of anxiety and fear. He's looking at Daniel, and Daniel has interpreted his dream before. He has all the confidence in the world that Daniel's going to interpret it. Everything's going to be okay. But now an astonishing thing happens. An unusual occurrence takes place. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for 1 hour, and his thoughts troubled him. He was mute. He couldn't say anything for an hour. That was very unusual for Daniel. And I can just see Nebuchadnezzar sitting there and waiting for a response, and waiting for a response, and waiting for a response, and he's looking at him, and Daniel is not saying a word, and he's just filled with consternation and filled with anxiety, and that's very much unlike Daniel. And Nebuchadnezzar's now concerned. Why was Daniel mute for 1 hour? Because for about 4 decades, for about 40 years, Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar had developed a close friendship. And Daniel knows that this dream does not bode well for Nebuchadnezzar. The king spake and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream of the interpretation thereof trouble thee. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. This is a serious thing, in other words. This is not a favorable dream, and it's not going to be a favorable interpretation. The tree that thou sawest, which grew and was strong, whose height reached unto the heaven, and the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and upon whose branches the fowls of the air had their habitation. It is thou, O king, that art grown and become strong. For thy greatness is grown and reacheth unto heaven, and thy dominion to the end of the earth. In short, Nebuchadnezzar at this point was the most powerful man in all the earth. His power, his prestige, his wealth was unsurpassed at this moment. Verse 23. And whereas the king saw a watcher and a holy one coming down from heaven, and saying, Hew the tree down and destroy it. Yet leave the stump of the roots thereof in the earth, even with the band of iron and brass and the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beast of the field, till 7 times pass over him. In other words, whatever's going to happen to Nebuchadnezzar is not going to kill him. He will retain his life. It's not coming from man, it's coming from heaven. This is something that is going to be done to him. But what about that phrase, 7 times pass over him? There's been a lot of discussion among commentators and those that have done in-depth studies on Daniel and this passage in particular, but I tend to agree with Rex Turner. He says, did the expression mean that Nebuchadnezzar would be removed from his throne for a period of 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 months, or 7 years? He writes, as a general rule, the expression until 7 times pass over would contemplate 7 years. In fact, that's what Homer Haley says in his commentary. Or actually, no, he doesn't. He says it's an indefinite period of time. I correct myself on that. He says it's an indefinite period. But there are others that say 7 years. One could hardly expect Nebuchadnezzar to be restored to his throne after an absence of 7 years. But 7 days or 7 weeks would hardly be a period sufficiently long to be a respectable time for Nebuchadnezzar to be removed from his throne, whereas 7 months would be both sufficiently long and short for him to be removed and then restored before his reign would be over. According to historians, Nebuchadnezzar reigned for a period of 43 years, which was, after all, quite an extended period of reign, and particularly in comparison to the years of the reigns of the kings who followed him. To illustrate, Amel-Marduk ruled for 2 years, Neriglissar for 4 years, and Nabonidus Belshazzar for 10 to 15 years, at which point the Babylonian Empire ceased. Now compare that with Nebuchadnezzar, 43 years. So here he's being told he's going to be removed from his throne for a period of time. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which is come upon my Lord the king. It's not from his enemies, it's from the Most High. That they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. And they shall make thee to eat grass as an oxen. And they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven. And 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. He's saying that Nebuchadnezzar is going to act and behave like an animal. Now, is that possible? Yes, it is. There is a rare mental disease known as boanthropy. Boanthropy. And it has affected certain individuals over the years. And in fact, the father of analytical psychology, Carl Jung, wrote in the book by the same name in 1976 on page 123, quote, Nebuchadnezzar was a complete regressive degeneration of a man who has overreached himself. He appealed to Nebuchadnezzar's example as an example of boanthropy. And in fact, any time that you Google boanthropy or look for it on the internet, you will find Nebuchadnezzar's name attached to it, the most famous example of this disorder. This was coming from heaven. This would afflict Nebuchadnezzar when he would least expect it, in other words. Right now, he is at the zenith of his power. Nothing's wrong with him otherwise. But God is going to afflict him. He continues, and whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the tree roots, thy kingdom shall be sure unto thee. After that thou shalt have known that the heavens do rule. In other words, you're going to continue to have your kingdom only after you acknowledge the Most High God. Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. Now you see that personal feeling that Daniel has for Nebuchadnezzar shines through. Daniel is concerned for Nebuchadnezzar as a man. Not as a king, not as his boss, not as the ruler over all of Babylon. He's concerned for Nebuchadnezzar's well-being spiritually. He's appealing to him. His personal feelings coming through. Break off your sins by righteousness. Change your ways now, in other words. Do it now. Thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. That's always been a characteristic of God's righteousness. Showing mercy to those who are least deserving of it. If it may be, he says, a lengthening of your tranquility. If you want everything to be as peaceful and as tranquil now as it always has been, if you want it to continue that way, Daniel's saying, change. Change your ways. He's doing it in the most kind and most loving way possible. It's not a confrontation. He's not pointing his finger at him. He's appealing to him. He's begging him as a friend. Change your ways. But then Daniel writes, all this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. He didn't change immediately. At the end of 12 months, he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. Notice this. Between the time that Daniel makes that heartfelt appeal to him to change, do what you need to do to make sure your life is tranquil, a full year goes by. Now you think about that. Nebuchadnezzar had not repented. He had not heeded Daniel's plea. He was just going on thinking everything's going to be okay. Nothing happened to me immediately. I think everything's going to be fine. So he just keeps on going. The king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? Oh boy. He had not learned. Pride was shining through in the very worst way. If you read anything about Nebuchadnezzar or about Babylon at this point and the glory of the city, what he's describing here as far as the majesty and the greatness of it, that was true in the sense of how majestic it looked and the advancements that had been made technologically at this point. But Nebuchadnezzar was saying, I've done this all myself. Pride. While the word was in the king's mouth, before he even got through saying what he said there in verse 30, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. One announcement, and it was done. Just as it had been promised. And they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. When that voice was spoken from heaven, do you not think that Nebuchadnezzar's face just was drained of all the blood possible? Everything comes back to him overwhelmingly. That dream that he had almost forgotten, I'm sure at this point, now comes back in a powerful way. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar. Within the hour. I would think probably within a few minutes, if truth be told. And of course Daniel's telling the truth, but he's not specifying exactly how long it took. But I suspect it wasn't that long between the announcement and when it happened. And he was driven from men and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. Now that's Daniel's commentary in this thing that's sent out to all the kingdom. Of course, it's through inspiration of the Holy Spirit, but what was sent out to the kingdom was a co-authorship between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel's telling what happened to the king. What a pitiful state indeed. You know, whenever I read that description, the first person that this reminds me of is what's the great the guy that was holed up in the penthouse in Vegas for so long, is very rich. Thank you, Howard Hughes. I was thinking Hugh Hefner for some reason. Howard Hughes is the guy's name. Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes, if you remember the description that was given to him about when he was holed up in his penthouse, his hair was long, his nails had grown out, you know. He had a cleanliness fetish from all accounts all of his life, and all of a sudden he just let himself go. Holed up in his penthouse. That reminds me of that. Of course, as far as we know, Hughes didn't have boanthropy, but he was afflicted with all sorts of other maladies, I'm sure. By the way, his ancestors were members of the church. He had direct connections with the churches of Christ, even though he never himself obeyed the truth, never was faithful, of course, to the Bible. He still had knowledge of the church and knowledge of gospel preachers in the past in his growing up. Still, fact is, what happened to Nebuchadnezzar was horrible. If you just get that picture in your head, he was driven from men, ate grass just like oxen. His body was wet from the dew of heaven. Why? Because he's wallowing around on the ground, just like an animal. His hair were grown like eagle's feathers. He's a hairy man, apparently, and his hair got real thick. And his nails like bird's claws. You ever read through the Guinness Book of World Records? Have you ever seen the pictures of the people that have the longest? It looks grotesque. You know, why would anybody want to do that? But yet, his nails were grown just like eagles or bird's claws. Now, the narrative shifts back from Daniel to Nebuchadnezzar. And at the end of the days, probably 7 months, even though we can't say for certain, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. See, Nebuchadnezzar is now reflecting back on all of this. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. What a confession! This is a confession from a man who's been humbled. This is the confession of a man who now knows who is preeminent. And it's not himself, it's God. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand, or say unto him, what doest thou? Here you have the same man physically, but a completely different man spiritually. He's changed. Completely changed. And all of this that you read here in verse 35 was not only said by Nebuchadnezzar, from God to Nebuchadnezzar, it was also spoken to Daniel and to Nebuchadnezzar's son, Marduk. So all of these things that were said were repeated by God over and over. So this man had changed. At the same time, my reason returned unto me. Get the picture. Here he is in the grass, wallowing around in the backyard of his palace, eating grass, and he all of a sudden comes to himself. Just think about looking at his physical appearance. Wouldn't that completely get to him? And so, he says, for the glory of my kingdom, mine honor and brightness returned unto me. And my counselors and my lords sought unto me. And I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. So at this point, he cleans himself up. He presents himself to his underlings, and all seems to be well. Now, who ruled in his place during this 7 times? I appeal again to Rex Turner. He says, on first thought, there is no answer to that question. But on second thought, there are some necessary explanations. For one explanation, some member or members of the king's family and or advisors to the king were necessarily very loyal to him. They had held the fact of his illness as a close private matter. Now, who would they be? Daniel would have been the chiefest one. Further, Nebuchadnezzar's son, Marduk, who later succeeded Nebuchadnezzar as king, was no doubt another. This supposition is necessarily indicated by an insert in 2 Kings chapters 25, verses 27 through 30. We won't read that passage, but I appeal to you to read that. A possible implication is that Marduk, who later succeeded his father as king, in conjunction with the guidance of Daniel, so skillfully administered the affairs of the government that the illness of King Nebuchadnezzar was not known publicly. One thing is certain. After a reign of some 40 years, Nebuchadnezzar was not without ambitious enemies, and principally among his own descendants and also his in-laws. Now, sometimes you see Marduk as referenced as evil Merodach. It doesn't necessarily refer to his character. It's simply the word evil being the Hebrew form of the man's Akkadian name, Marduk. Evil is not a translation of a Hebrew word meaning evil, but it represents in English letters the way a Jew would have pronounced the sounds of the Akkadian name Marduk. It sort of gives you an explanation of that name sometimes. The term evil Merodach appears in 2 Kings 25 and in Jeremiah chapter 52. Now, what's the point of all this? It's simply this, that when Nebuchadnezzar was in this state, boanthropy, that was stricken, that God struck him with, that the affairs of state continued on as normally as they had been before. Now, that's not without precedent. In our country, if you know anything about history, you know that the late presidency, the latter part of the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, was characterized by the fact that he was stricken by a great stroke while he was in office. And that fact was hidden by the public in general. And by all accounts, his wife was the one that ruled as president in Wilson's name. And only a few people knew about that when it happened. So, something like this being done in government is not something that's without precedent at all. And so, since the kingdom was running smoothly at this point, it wouldn't have been that big of a problem for things to continue on as they were, as long as it didn't extend out over a lengthy period of time. If it was 7 months, they could manage that. 7 years, that would be a problem. 7 days or weeks wouldn't even be a thing for Nebuchadnezzar. But 7 months is a likely period of time for him to have been stricken with this and for him to finally have the time to come back to his senses and acknowledge God. And so, by this point, we see that everything is given back to him. Now Nebuchadnezzar concludes, I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride, as he had done, he is able to abase. And he knew that for a fact. What a testimony of faith. His conversion was genuine. He was now a worshiper of the true God. But the fact of the matter is, within just 1 or 2 generations, this faith that Nebuchadnezzar had would be forgotten by his descendants and the inheritors of the kingdom. Now, next week, we're going to skip over to chapter 7. So, we're going to go to Daniel 7 next week, and I will explain why. We're not going in chapter 5. We're going over to chapter 7. I'll explain why at the beginning of our class session next Sunday.